Forget what Hollywood showed about the Old West. Reality was very different. These famous gunslingers didn't die in epic duels at sunset. Most had ordinary ends: illness, betrayal by friends, or they simply grew old, alone, and forgotten. Here are 18 true stories the movies will never tell. Subscribe to our channel and drop some hype in the video to help us out. Number 1. Buffalo Bill turned the Old West into a worldwide show, taking cowboys and Indians to audiences across Europe and America. What few people know is that he died basically broke in 1917, staying at his sister's house in Denver. But things get weird after that. His body went 6 months without being buried, getting embalmed several times while they decided where to lay him to rest. When he finally ended up on Lookout Mountain in Colorado, the town of Cody, Wyoming, swore Denver had stolen the body. To this day, people there believe Buffalo Bill's real remains are somewhere else. The state of Colorado even put concrete over the grave to prevent any attempted theft. A dispute that lasted decades over a man who became a living legend and, after he died, kept stirring up controversy. Number 2. Bat Masterson. This guy was a living legend of the Old West. He worked as a sheriff in Dodge City when the town was basically synonymous with chaos and shootouts. He went up against outlaws, cheating gamblers, and survived duels that left a lot of people on the ground. But here's what few people know. Masterson walked away from it all. He hung up his guns, left the West behind, and moved to New York. He became a sports columnist, writing about boxing for a city newspaper. The man who was once feared in dusty streets now wore a suit and hammered away at a typewriter. On October 25, 1921, at 67, he was sitting at his desk writing yet another column when he suffered a massive heart attack. He died right there, pen in hand. The gunslinger who dodged so many bullets met his end in the quietest way possible. Number 3. Wyatt Earp, 1923. 6 years before he died, the man behind the most famous shootout in the Old West was living in Los Angeles, trying to get Hollywood to tell his story the right way. Earp spent his days on Western film sets, giving advice to directors and young actors who could hardly believe they were standing in front of a living legend. The funny thing is, he never got paid a dime for it. When he died in 1929 at 80, it was those same movie actors who carried his casket and cried at the funeral. Tom Mix, one of the biggest stars of the time, was seen wiping away tears. The gunslinger who survived dozens of armed showdowns passed away of natural causes, something rare for men of his time and line of work. Number 4. Doc Holliday, 1887. Check out this interesting story. This guy graduated as a dentist in Philadelphia at 20, but tuberculosis changed everything. The doctors said he had months to live, so he headed to the dry West, thinking the climate would help. And it did, for a while. But instead of pulling teeth, Doc found out he was really good at cards and on the trigger. He became famous in the gunfight at the OK Corral alongside the Earp brothers, where 3 men died in less than 30 seconds. The disease never let up. He drank whiskey to handle the coughing and spent his nights in saloons playing poker. In the end, he wound up in a sanatorium in Colorado, so skinny it was sad. They say his last words were, looking at his own bare feet, saying, "This is funny," because he always thought he'd die with his boots on. Number 5. Annie Oakley wasn't born famous. She came from a family so poor in Ohio that by the time she was 8, she was already hunting to put food on the table. But here's the detail few people know. She paid off her mom's house mortgage by selling the game she brought down, a child. Before she was even 15, Annie had paid the whole debt. When she turned 21, she faced a professional shooter named Frank Butler in a competition and won. A year later, they got married. Together for 50 years, she became the biggest draw in Buffalo Bill's legendary show, impressing even the Queen of England. In November 1926, Annie died at 66. Frank Butler, the man she beat and then loved for the rest of her life, stopped eating. 18 days later, he was gone too. They were buried side by side, just like they lived. Number 6. You're looking at the face of a kid who became a legend before he was 22. Billy the Kid grew up an orphan, stole his first clothes at 15, and never stopped after that. The official story says he killed 21 men, one for every year he lived. True or exaggerated? Nobody really knows for sure. What we do know is that he escaped from jail twice, including a spectacular breakout where he killed 2 guards while handcuffed. Pat Garrett, who had once been his friend, got the job of hunting him down. On the night of July 14, 1881, Garrett waited hidden in a dark room in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Billy walked in shirtless, asking in Spanish who was in there. Garrett fired twice. The most wanted kid in the West died barefoot, with no chance to draw his gun. He was only 21 and already immortal. Number 7. Davy Crockett. You probably grew up hearing stories about this guy in a coonskin cap. But the truth is a lot more complicated than the movies made it seem. Crockett was a bear hunter, a soldier, and even served in the U.S. Congress, where he had a major falling out with President Andrew Jackson. When he lost re-election, he told the people of Tennessee they could go to hell and headed to Texas. In March 1836, he was at the Alamo with fewer than 200 men facing thousands of Mexican soldiers. The fort fell on March 6th and Crockett died at 49. Now here's the controversial part. Some say he fought to the very end. Others claim he was captured and executed afterward. A Mexican diary found decades later fueled that argument. What really happened that morning? We may never know for sure. Number 8. Jesse James was only 34 when his story ended in a way nobody saw coming. The guy who kept banks and trains in panic for more than a decade didn't die in a shootout or on the run from the law. On April 3, 1882, he was in his own living room, calm, straightening a picture on the wall. Bob Ford, a guy Jesse considered a trusted partner, was there in his house. When Jesse turned his back and climbed up on a chair to wipe dust off the frame, Ford pulled his revolver and put a clean shot into the back of his head. What a lot of people don't know is that Ford had made a secret deal with the governor of Missouri to get pardoned for his own crimes. The reward for Jesse's head was up to $10,000. A fortune back then, the equivalent of more than $300,000 today. Number 9. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid built the most organized gang in the Old West, the Wild Bunch, which robbed banks and trains for years while the law tried to catch up with them. When the pressure in the United States became unbearable, they did something few outlaws would have the guts to do. They fled to South America and kept operating in Argentina and Bolivia. In November 1908, after a robbery in San Vicente, Bolivian soldiers surrounded the duo's hideout. The shootout was intense, and when the silence came, Sundance was dead from gunshot wounds, and Cassidy supposedly took his own life. But here's the detail that still fuels theories today. The bodies were never identified with absolute certainty, And over the decades, several people claimed that one or both survived and returned to the United States, living under fake identities. Number 10. 2 days before turning 41, Belle Starr was riding back home in Oklahoma's Indian Territory. Someone was waiting hidden along the road. 2 shotgun blasts to the back knocked her off her horse. The killer then walked up and fired one more time in her face. To this day, nobody knows who pulled the trigger. The main suspects? Her own son, Edgar, whom she had publicly beaten days earlier, and a neighbor she was fighting over land with. Belle had built a dangerous reputation. She married horse thieves, hid fugitives from the law, and became a legend in the newspapers of the time, which loved stories about women outlaws. The truth is, she knew all the worst criminals of the Old West and kept too many secrets. Any one of them had a reason to want her quiet forever. Number 11. Wild Bill Hickok. You ever heard of the dead man's hand? Yeah, it exists because of this guy right here. James Butler Hickok was the kind of man you didn't want to piss off. A crack shot, a feared lawman, and one of the most dangerous men in the Old West. But Wild Bill had a vice: poker, and that's exactly what killed him. In August 1876, he was in a saloon in Deadwood, South Dakota. For the first time in his life, he sat with his back to the door. A fatal mistake for someone with that many enemies. Jack McCall, a guy Bill had humiliated the day before at a card table, walked into the saloon and shot him in the back of the head without warning. When Hickok's body hit the floor, his cards spilled out. 2 pairs, aces, and 8s. Ever since, any player who gets that combo knows they're holding the dead man's hand. Number 12. Calamity Jane. Martha Jane. Cannery lived a life that few men of that time could have handled. She worked as a scout for the Army, crossed hostile territory, and built a reputation that mixed courage with scandal. What a lot of people don't know is that Jane spent years telling stories about herself that were, at the very least, exaggerated. She claimed she'd been Wild Bill Hickok's lover, but historians have never really confirmed that. Alcohol was a constant companion. In her last decades, Jane drifted between Wild West shows and bars, spending the little she made on booze. In August 1903, pneumonia took her at 51. Her body was wrecked by decades of alcoholism. Here's the strange part: they buried Jane next to Wild Bill in Deadwood. Some say it was what she wanted. Others swear it was a joke by the townspeople. Number 13. Pat Garrett became famous for ending Billy the Kid's life in 1881, but what few people know is how he himself ended his days. In 1908, Garrett was caught up in a land dispute in New Mexico. The man who had faced gunmen head-on was shot in the back while he stopped to pee on the side of a road. He was 57. The suspect, a rancher named Wayne Brazel, went to trial and claimed self-defense. The jury cleared him in less than 15 minutes, even though the shot came from behind. Many believe powerful men wanted Garrett out of the way and used Brazel as a scapegoat. The full truth never came out. The outlaw hunter died like many of the men he chased. Number 14. John Wesley Hardin was considered the most dangerous gunman in Texas. By 15, he'd already committed his first murder. They say he killed more than 40 men, including a guy in a hotel, just because he snored too loud in the room next door. He spent 16 years in prison and got out swearing he'd changed, even became a lawyer. But the Old West doesn't forgive. In August 1895, he was shooting dice in an El Paso saloon when John Selman, a local lawman, walked in and shot him in the back. Hardin was 42. Ironic, right? The man who faced dozens of gunmen head-on died without even seeing who pulled the trigger. Selman claimed self-defense, but witnesses told a different story. Number 15, Black Bart, the bandit who left poems. Charles Bowles robbed 28 Wells Fargo stagecoaches in California between 1875 and 1883. He never fired a single shot. The guy would show up in the middle of the road wearing a flour sack over his head with eye holes cut out and order everyone to get down. He only took the company's strongbox, never touched the passengers. The detail that drove the police crazy was something else. He left poems signed as Black Bart inside the empty boxes. The verses mocked Wells Fargo and made headlines in the newspapers of the time. The company put detectives on him for years. A handkerchief with a laundry mark is what brought the crime poet down. They traced it to San Francisco and found out Bart was a polite 54-year-old man, a Civil War veteran. He served 4 years in prison and vanished in 1888. Some say he went to New York. Others swear Wells Fargo paid him a pension to stop robbing. Nobody knows for sure how it ended. Number 16, Bass Reeves. Born enslaved in Arkansas in 1838, this man would become Outlaw's worst nightmare in the Old West. After the Civil War, he knew every trail in Indian Territory like the back of his hand. The federal government noticed and made him one of the first black U.S. deputy marshals in American history. For 3 decades, Reeves hunted the worst criminals on the frontier, arresting more than 3,000 of them. They say he was never hit by a bullet, even when taking on whole gangs. He used disguises, spoke several indigenous languages, and had a kind of marksmanship that became legendary. Many historians believe his story inspired the Lone Ranger character. He died in January 1910 in Muskogee, Oklahoma, at 71 from kidney problems. A man who started out in chains and ended up putting chains on others. Number 17, Tom Horn. Do you recognize this face? Tom Horn was one of the most contradictory guys in the Old West. He worked as an Army scout hunting Geronimo, became a Pinkerton detective, and later started going after cattle rustlers for big ranchers in Wyoming. The problem is, Horn didn't arrest anyone. He simply took the targets out and left a rock under their head as his signature. In 1901, a 14-year-old boy named Willie Nickel was shot in the back. Horn was in the area. During a whiskey-soaked interrogation, he supposedly confessed to the crime, though later he claimed he was drunk and making it up. The jury didn't buy that. In November 1903, Horn walked up to the gallows in Cheyenne, insisting he was innocent. To this day, historians debate whether he really killed the boy or was sacrificed to cover up the real culprits. Number 18. Pearl Hart became known as the last person to rob a stagecoach in the American Old West, and she was a woman. In 1899, she and a partner stopped a stagecoach in Arizona and took about $400 from the passengers. The case became a national sensation because nobody expected a woman to pull off that kind of crime. Pearl was captured, tried, and convicted, but she spent only about 5 years in prison. After she got out, she simply disappeared from public life. Some stories say she got married and lived quietly. Others claim she kept getting into trouble. What's certain is that she died in 1955, at 84, in Arizona, of natural causes. A whole lifetime after that famous robbery, and almost nobody remembered her anymore. Hollywood preferred to create legends of outlaws who went down shooting, not little old ladies forgotten in small desert towns.